You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet.
Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. This episode is brought to you with the support of our sponsor XDEEP and the patrons of Speaking Sidemount. My huge thanks to both. Your very kind support makes everything you're about to listen to possible. In considering guests to join me on the show, along with a focus on bringing you the very best in sidemount and cave diving, every now and again I'll go off topic and bring you a special guest that can speak on topics that are super interesting and of interest to all divers. Earlier in episode 39, we spoke with Gareth Locke on human factors in diving. And in this, the first of two special episodes, we speak with Professor Simon Mitchell, one of the world's leading hyperbaric physicians. Now, as a fellow New Zealander or Kiwi, I've known of Simon since the early 90s, but for a variety of reasons, until recently, we had never met. When we finally were introduced, it was like a couple of long-lost friends catching up. Along with diving, Simon and I share a common past, having both served in the Royal New Zealand Navy and also on the frigate HMNZS Canterbury, which you will have heard me reference many, many times as my absolute favourite local dive wreck. Now, Simon has published numerous research papers on hyperbaric medicine, including some stellar work interpreting and explaining research conducted at the US Naval Experimental Dive Unit, or NEDU. This research was into the efficacy of deep stops, and to get an idea of the impact of Simon's contribution in this respect, you only need to look at the changes in our dive practices and gradient factors that have resulted from listening to his presentations. If you haven't heard or seen these, I'll pop some links in the podcast notes. Now, in this episode, part one of my discussions with Simon, we get into how he got into diving and why he joined the Navy, and how these experiences have contributed to his diving and medical career. And then we reminisce a little about our time in the service and what we got from it. Then we get into our discussions on decompression. We start by taking a crack at drawing a line under the deep stops discussion, and then we talk about a bunch of other factors, many of which are quite likely to be far more important to your decompression than the depth of your deepest stop. We talk about the impact of PFOs and why bubbles in the arterial circulation are an issue. We look at dehydration and its impact on circulation, temperature and diver comfort, and why physically working at depth and after a dive is not advised, and why light exercise during decompression might actually be an advantage. All this and much, much more in this episode of Speaking Sidemount.
Hey Simon, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Thanks, Steve. A real pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Now, you're the head of the Department of Anesthesiology, School of Medicine, Auckland University, or University of Auckland, as I should say. And thank God I've had Richard Harry Harris on the show before. So therefore, this is not the first time I've had to say anesthesiologist. So, but I guess more important to us, you're a very, very skilled technical and rebreather diver, passionate about deep shipwrecks. You're also world-renowned as a diving physician and hyperbaric medicine specialist. And there's a heap I want to get into there. But before we go too far, let's clear up a couple of points. This is Speaking Sidemount. Have you ever actually dived sidemount?
No, not unless you count stage tanks or sling tanks hanging off your side during a dive. So no, like the truth is, technically, no, I have not.
All right. Okay.
And that probably reflects the fact that I'm more of a wreck diver than a cave diver, although, sidemount's great in wrecks too, but I've never had too much trouble squeezing through the sort of tight places that you really need to get through. So no.
Yeah. I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to make an exception. I've only done this once before. So here we go. You're on the show and it's too late to cancel now. So let's carry on. Now, you and I also so nearly go back a long way. In 1992, I was the Marine Engineer Officer of the New Zealand frigate Canterbury, and not at all related to your impending arrival, but I resigned my commission late that year and posted off just as you joined the ship for its 93 deployment. And I know we both loved our time on Canterbury. So let's reminisce a bit. Tell us about your time serving in the Navy and on HMNZS Canterbury.
Yes, Steve, I joined the Navy in the beginning of 92. And the whole point of that was to do diving medicine. Diving had been driving my career choices up to that point, and the Navy was no different. Des Gorman had just arrived, and that place was quite a hotbed of diving medicine interest. So I joined the Navy in 92 and then got really lucky in 93 to get put on Canterbury for that round the world deployment. As you know, we went up through the Pacific, through Panama, the UK, the Baltic, Stockholm, down through the Med, through Suez Canal, back down through Asia. It was an extraordinary deployment. And, I was a medical officer, and it was just the most amazing adventure. As you well know, you see and do things in the Navy that you would never see and do in any other circumstance. And that deployment was no different. Amazing time.
Yeah, it was a brilliant time to be in the Navy too, because we happened to be in just this stellar period of peacetime as well. So there weren't really any wars for us to go and fight. So of course we go and do what we do, and we practice warfare. And at the same time, there's a fairly large diplomacy requirement for a driver for the Navy and the forces as well. And the deployments brought Wellington back from the UK and had a similar experience of crossing the planet in a warship and stopping off at various ports and experiencing different cultures and meeting people from various services around the world as well. It was an amazing time, wasn't it?
Incredible. Yeah. You hit the nail on the head when you said, you go to all these different places. They're all exotic. They're all very different. And you meet really interesting people, get to experience these cities from your own little personal floating hotel where everything's kind of laid on for you. Especially the thing that struck me about it was you're also on board a ship with all these really neat guys, and you form these extremely strong friendships that kind of last a lifetime, even if you don't see these people for years. When you do get back together with them, it's just the same. And even you and I, we actually never sailed on a ship together, but because we had that shared experience and understood exactly what we were respectively talking about, when we met at Northland Dive last year, we had 2 hours of conversation that just flowed like a river because, we knew exactly what we were respectively talking about. No, amazing time. It really was.
Yeah. And it's a ship, as many of our listeners know. I wrote a book on Canterbury, and I've done many hundreds of dives on it now. And it actually is, believe it or not, it's a purpose-sunk wreck, and yet it's one of my favorite wreck dives ever. And I've been to Truck Lagoon. I love everything there. But Canterbury is this amazing playground. A lot of it's very benign and designed for the lower end of wreck diving. And then some of the deeper spaces are genuine overheads and really quite challenging dives. And so have you done very many dives on Canterbury, or have you had the opportunity to go and revisit some of the spaces that you knew so well?
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't say I've done a lot of dives. I've been there a couple of times. My big priority was to visit my cabin, which was strategically placed, as it turns out, right next door to the officers' heads. The logic being that the medical officer would get to hear any gastrointestinal disorders that were prevalent amongst the officer cohort. And actually, quite interestingly, your successor, the MEO, was pretty interested in that himself, self-appointed medical officer. And used to spend quite a bit of time in my cabin, laughing our heads off at the various noises that were coming out of the officer's head. So my cabin was right next door on the officer flat.
I know the cabin
side, if I recall correctly. Well away from the heads. Very strategic of you. I've been there, and I've been through most of Canterbury. Yeah, I know. I totally agree. Actually, it's a dive that has something for everyone. Even if you're moderately experienced advanced wreck diver and like crawling into the tight dark spaces, there are some places like that on Canterbury. So highly recommended, and a lot of emotional, memories.
Yeah, people often ask me what it was like diving it. And certainly the first time I wasn't knowing what to expect. And I dived it about 3 months after it was sunk. So there was this, there's my ship on the bottom. It was very clean in those days as well. So it was very white, even though it's a warship grey, it looked white underwater. And it was quite stark the first time and interesting. Of course, I made a beeline for the MEO's cabin. And I did spend a bit of time down your corridor there. So as an assistant engineer, that's usually where you end up as well. Although you don't tend to get that last cabin. But now I'm so happy that it's a dive wreck compared to being scrapped and turned into razor blades, as we say. What a great use of a shipwreck at the end of its life, given that they don't tend to have a lot of value and you can strip out a lot of the expensive equipment and so on. I just think it's the best thing you can possibly do to a ship once it's finished its life in service.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. it would have been terrible to see it broken up. And now people can go and visit it. No, I'm totally on board with that. And I also agree that it was weird seeing it underwater, but when you rationalize it in the way you just did, Steve, yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's move on a bit. So we talked a little bit about the way that you got into the Navy to forward your career in diving, but let's talk about how you got started in diving, and then how, in fact, did the Navy progress your career, and what did you do there?
Yeah, look, I grew up in Wellington, and in a little seaside suburb in the eastern suburbs out beyond the airport called Seatoun. And we had that whole south coast of Wellington kind of right at our doorstep. And it was just what the kids in our suburb did, So I'm talking around the ages of 10 or 11, we would just walk over to Breaker Bay, put a jersey on our tops, a jersey on our bottom, like head couldn't afford a wetsuit, have a stick with a nail tied to the end of it and tried to stick it into fish, of course, quite unsuccessfully. But I mean, the whole underwater world thing had this amazing beauty and intrigue about it. And I just completely fell in love with diving, and everything beyond that point was towards, every choice I made in my life was towards furthering my diving career. So, when I left school, I went and did marine biology. When I finished that, I went to medical school. And, that was all quite a story, because I wasn't a particularly good student. I had to work very hard to get into med school. I was diving too much. That was the problem. Diving when I should have been in class.
Studying, huh?
It is one of the things about diving is that it can grip you in that way. It's not just a sport, it can become a lifestyle. Like I remember doing paper rounds just to be able to afford to buy scuba gear, and I couldn't even buy it all at once. So, I had a scuba tank sitting in the middle of my bedroom for years, before I could buy a regulator. And then it does grip you in that way. So yeah, after leaving medical school, I just wanted to do diving medicine. And I think I mentioned before, Des Gorman had just arrived from Adelaide, created a very vibrant, kind of prestigious diving medicine environment in the New Zealand Navy. And so that just was a logical extension. And I followed him in there, and absolutely no regrets. I mean, the Navy was a fabulous place to be at that time, because we're talking the mid-90s. There was a lot of diving happening in New Zealand. We had a very exuberant diving population who weren't particularly good at following the rules, and we were treating a lot of decompression sickness. In 1995, we treated 100 cases of decompression sickness.
Remember, computers weren't in broad use at that time, so it was very much a tables-driven time, wasn't it?
It was, and that meant a lot of people were just too lazy to actually do the planning.
Yes.
There was a lot of guesswork going into diving, and I think that contributed to it. I mean, that's quite multifactorial, that whole story about why there were so many cases back then. But yeah, in terms of getting experience-based expertise in diving medicine, just brilliant and hard to do now. We're treating like less than a quarter of those sorts of numbers these days. And for someone coming into the field now, it's really hard to do cases because they're just not so many. So a great time to be there. And, the chamber was brand new. Des was there, lots of cases. It was a really good time to be in the Navy.
And one of the things that's always interested me is you were able to clearly meld your medical career with hyperbaric medicine. And there seems to be a connection between anesthesiology and diving medicine. I mean, what are your thoughts on the relationship between the two disciplines?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Steve. Of course, I didn't do anesthesiology until somewhat later, but you're right. There are quite clear linkages. They're both clinical and theoretical. So, in diving, we deal with gas physiology. We breathe from gas supply equipment, and in particular, rebreathers, which are sort of circle circuits. And that's exactly what an anesthesiologist does every day of their working lives. They run circle circuits, they run gases, they deal with gas physiology. So there's that kind of equipment linkage. And then there's this whole thing that, anesthesiology teaches you a lot of life support skills. So airway management, resuscitation, the use of cardiac supportive drugs. In other words, an anesthetist is probably the person you most want hanging around if you decide to have a cardiac arrest or some kind of critical event like drowning. An anesthetist is very highly skilled in all the things that you might need, all the right procedures you might need to deal with a situation like that. So anesthesia is a very appealing specialty to someone who's contemplating being out in the field with divers where things might go wrong and they might have to step in and take active steps to save someone's life. And in that sense, no disrespect to my dermatology colleagues, but, you'd rather have an anaesthetist than a dermatologist. There's plenty of times when you'd rather have a dermatologist, but that's not one of them.
Yeah, what's this nasty rash I've got here?
That's right. Well, yeah, so you're an ex-Navy guy, but, that's kind of the point too. So anesthesiology has these linkages with diving that are both clinically based and based on the sort of theory and practices that we use in the operating room.
Okay, well, let's move on a bit more. And I think one of the things that I've noted, of course, in bringing you on the show is that you're really well known for a series of lectures that you did some years ago that were promoted through Dan South Africa, in particular the decompression controversies one, I think was the first that I saw, where you mused on the optimal approach for decompression and effectively took an evidence-based approach to decompression and really used that to refute deep stops, which was a little surprising at the time. I know for me, the information you gave was so compelling that I immediately changed my dive practice. I changed my gradient factors and moved my emphasis, more towards shallower stops. And personally, I think you've done such a good job at this that now deep stops really are refuted and it's almost time to put it to bed. You and I spoke about this at TechFest a month or two ago, but let's give it a few minutes just to put a line underneath deep stops for a moment and get your closing thoughts, given my introduction there.
Yeah, that's a pretty good introduction, Steve. Look, one of the points I'd like to make is that I'm a scientist, and as such, I seek evidence to answer questions, and I also follow convincing evidence that's provided by other scientists working in the field as well. So in other words, as a scientist, you follow evidence. Now, applying that process to the deep stops debate, I've actually done very little original work in that area. Like I'm not one of the researchers that's actually studied it, but I've certainly interpreted that evidence very carefully and painstakingly. So if we go back to the late 90s, we were all using kind of Bullman gas content algorithms for decompression. So, non-deep stop type approaches. And at that time that, people were getting decompression sickness when, according to the tables they were using, they shouldn't. And Doppler technology was showing that we were forming bubbles after these dives. And people put two and two together and basically said, well, our decompression algorithms aren't working very well. And at about the same time, there was this proposal that the so-called bubble models, which, were supposed to be designed to prevent bubble formation in the first place, by putting stops in at deeper depths than the gas content models that we were using. That idea came into the fore and people jumped on it because it sounded theoretically attractive. Let's prevent bubbles from forming in the first place. Bubbles cause decompression sickness. So if we can stop them forming, then obviously we'll prevent decompression sickness. And that notion became virtually unstoppable. Lots of people started putting stops in very deep, and the bubble models, they predicted that you would need quite deep stops. So there was this shift towards deeper stopping. And look, the truth is I was on board with that. The whole thing made so much sense that I was one of the ones who embraced it. And you can find stuff that I wrote around 2000, saying, hey, bubble models, I'm sure that in the fullness of time, we'll have great data supporting this, because that point is very important. This whole initiative, this trend that pervaded the entire diving industry actually came in with virtually no evidence. It was a theory that was so attractive that everyone embraced it. And then, so we ran with that for a number of years. And actually, it didn't stop people getting decompression sickness, I can tell you that for sure. But it wasn't critically examined for quite some time. And then a little bit of data started dribbling out from various places. There was a French study that showed that bubble models didn't seem to be as good as a more old-fashioned approach in a very small study they did. And then there was this big study by the US Navy, the so-called NEDU study, which kind of unequivocally showed that a deep stop approach was not as good as a shallower stop approach. And the whole purpose of this podcast is not to dig into all of that, but that study really rocked the world and it created a lot of controversy. And what I can say is that the answers to the criticisms of that study are out there if people want to go and see them. The study was actually a very good study. It was a landmark study. They used decompression sickness as the outcome measure. Like who does that these days? That's That's pretty amazing. Not just bubbles, they use decompression sickness, actual decompression sickness in their subjects. And since that time, there have been several other studies that have also shown the same thing. So what we've got is a bunch of evidence that's fundamentally confluent that is showing that if you overemphasize deep stops, it doesn't give you the most efficient decompression, which is the least amount of risk for the amount of time that you're going to spend decompressing. And there's essentially no evidence supporting deep stops. You'd think that if it really was a good strategy, so at least some of the studies, there'd be some equipoise in the results, but there's not. It's all trending in the same direction. Now, it is very important to understand that every decompression needs its deepest stop, right? So it's not that a deep stop, however you define that, is bad. It's just that you don't want to make your stops too deep because you're not gaining anything and possibly losing something if you make them too deep. So the argument really should be not are deep stops bad or have we refuted deep stops? The argument or the debate is about where should your deepest stop be? Because every decompression needs a deepest stop. It's just if you put it too deep, then that's inefficient because, to summarize very quickly, you're probably taking more gas on than you're losing if you make your stops too deep. So the current debate is where's that sweet spot for making your deepest stop? And I actually don't have the answer to that. This is part of that science process that I alluded to just before. We're in this phase now where we think that bubble models probably put the deepest stop too deep, that no one's saying, you should do endlessly shallower stops. I mean, if that were the argument, then you just come straight to the surface and don't do any stops. Clearly,
exactly.
That doesn't work. So somewhere in between these extremes is a sweet spot. And the exact identity of that sweet spot and how to apply it to the myriad of different dives we do is tricky. We still don't have an answer to that. I mean, people always ask me, what gradient factors do you use, And I'm very happy to talk about that. I mean, I'm sitting somewhere around a gradient factor low of 50 and a gradient factor high of 70 or 80, depending on where I am and if I'm the only diving physician in the place. But I quite like to be conservative and I don't really care about spending a bit of extra time in the water if it makes me safer, so long as it's safe to be in the water. So that's where I am at the moment. But that, to some extent, is a guess. It's sort of evidence-based. But a bubble model approach or a deep stop approach would have had me at a gradient factor low of 10 or 20. So, clearly we've evolved, but how far we should evolve in that direction is still an open question. So I tend to not say these days, look, deep stops are bad. I'm not saying that. Every dive has to have its deepest stop. What I am saying is, and what the evidence says, is that bubble model prescribed deep stops are probably too deep. Does that mean you can't do them? Of course not. Lots of people use bubble models and generally are fine. But if you want to know the truth in the universe about safety, then you're probably safer doing less deep stopping than a bubble model would suggest. Anyway, there's an attempt at, trying to put it
without diagrams, as we said earlier. And I guess we're coming at it from two perspectives, aren't we? We're trying to arrange our diving or plan our diving in a way that makes our diving better and more efficient, but also we're trying to avoid harm at the same time. And by being efficient, I mean minimizing our decompression and at the same time avoiding harm in the form of DCS. And I guess we've kind of settled on Borman as the algorithm with gradient factors seems to be what most people are using, with us pushing more time towards shallow stops. But we've talked about deep stops, we've talked about bubble models versus dissolved gas models, I guess you'd call them. But there's other factors that also are risk factors for decompression sickness as well, aren't there? And how should we address those in our dive planning?
Yeah, there's lots of those. It is fascinating, Steve, that we've become so obsessed with decompression and its theory and physiology and all that kind of stuff. And to some extent, we've ignored those other things, which I will come to in a second. I do think it's worth noting, though, that this obsession that I'm being critical of with decompression and its physiology is actually emblematic of one of the cool things about diving, and that is that it's more than just jumping in the water and swimming around. There's a whole intellectual exercise associated with it. And I think that's one of the things that pulls people in. They like to exercise their brain. They like to understand these complicated concepts. And when they combine that with a recreational passion, that's a very cool thing. So that's just a side note, really, that diving has this
completely.
really neat aspect to it, which is more than just jumping in the water and swimming around. Anyway, getting back to your point, yeah, there are a lot of other risk factors, and there's pretty good evidence that some of them are extremely important, and probably much more so than this debate we're having about deep stops. So just by way of example, there are risk factors that are related to us as humans, like our physiology, and then there are risk factors that are related to the diving we do or the diving environment that we're in. So an example of the physiology one, the classic one that kind of everyone knows about these days, is the so-called patent foramen ovale, the communication between the two upper chambers of the heart that allows a bit of blood from the venous side of the circulation to get onto the arterial side. And if there's any bubbles in the veins, which there are after most dives, then those bubbles, instead of getting filtered out by the lung circulation before they get into the arteries, those bubbles can get into the arteries by crossing the patent foramen ovale, or PFO. And there's unequivocal evidence that that is a risk factor for serious neurological decompression sickness. So you have a big PFO. Lots of people have PFOs, by the way, probably about 25 or 30%, but only a small proportion of those, maybe less than 5%, maybe as low as 1%, actually have a big one. But if you have that, then you are definitely at risk. And so right there is a physiological predisposition to decompression sickness that's probably way more important than the decompression models.
Can I ask you an amplifying question on that? So we've dived, we've got bubbles on the venous side of the circulatory system. What's the big deal with it getting to the arterial side versus venous?
Oh, yeah, no, great question. Well, in the veins, the first capillary bed, tiny blood vessels that those bubbles will reach, is the lungs. So the lungs trap these venous bubbles, and the lungs are actually very good at eliminating them. The gas gets breathed out and the bubbles disappear, basically. Whereas if these bubbles are allowed to get onto the arterial side, they're actually still very small bubbles, but we have pretty good evidence now that what happens with them is if they distribute around the body, they'll get to all sorts of places. And if they get to a place where early after a dive that still has a high level of residual nitrogen after the diver has surfaced, then the gas from the tissue where the bubble has arrived in can diffuse from the tissue into the bubble,
right? The bubble
and make
grows.
the bubble grow. And therefore a tiny bubble that normally wouldn't cause a problem gets big enough to cause a problem. And that we think is probably important in some of these tissues where PFO seems to matter. So like the inner ear or the spinal cord. It also seems to be important in skin decompression sickness, which isn't of itself serious, but and also the brain. So that's the reason why these little bubbles getting into the arterial side is bad and getting filtered out by the lungs is not bad. So that's why having a PFO is a disadvantage. Yeah.
That was great to clear that one up. Okay. What about some of the other factors? You started to talk about physiological factors. So PFO is one. Are there other physiological factors?
Well, there probably are, but we're not so familiar with them. There are certain physiological predispositions that we think are important. So another one might be dehydration. Dehydration can cause a reduction in circulation in the body, and it's circulation that carries gas to and from tissues. So if you think about it, let's just say you start a dive and you're well hydrated and the circulation around your body is really good. That will carry gas in quickly. But then later in a long technical dive, and some of these dives people are doing these days are 5, 6, 7, 8 longer hours.
Yeah.
And you've become dehydrated, then the perfusion or blood flow to the tissues is less than it was when the gas was being carried in. Now you're trying to carry it out with less blood flow. So, it's an asymmetric process. And that probably explains why dehydration can be a problem. So dehydration is another example. But then there's a bunch of environmental things as well, or characteristics of the dive, I guess you'd call them. And a big one of those, a really big one, is temperature. That's always been talked about, but I don't think we've ever been as convinced as we are today that it's important, or as important as it is. So there was a study that was published by the Navy Experimental Diving Unit, the same group that did the Deep Stop study a few years ago. And they did a fascinating study where they could have people doing a dive in a wet chamber, but then transfer them into, either a warm water environment or a cooler water environment during the decompression. And so they could have these different combinations of conditions. So you could be warm during your time on the bottom and cold during decompression, or cold at the bottom and warm during decompression, or warm, warm and cold, cold. So these different combinations. And what they showed was that being warm on the bottom and cold during the decompression resulted in literally an order of magnitude, 10 times the risk of decompression sickness. Again, using decompression sickness as an outcome measure, 10 times the risk, as being cold on the bottom and warm during the decompression. And it's almost certainly to do with exactly the same thing I just described to you, in relation to perfusion and hydration. So if you're warm during your time at the bottom, all your tissues are, nicely circulating and take up gas very readily. And then if you get cold, everything shuts down and there's less blood flow. And so again, you've got an asymmetric process. You take up gas when there's lots of blood flow and you're trying to get rid of it when there's not so much blood flow. And that creates a situation where you can form more bubbles. Whereas if you do it the opposite way around, so you're cold on the bottom, so you shut down during the time you're absorbing gas, but then circulation improves when you get warm, when you're getting rid of the gas during decompression, then that's advantageous. But of course, that's quite hard to manipulate in that way for a real dive, right? So no one wants to be cold intentionally during their time at the bottom. And also that would be quite hard to do. Like, you're diving in a dry suit. It's not like you can flood it and then unflood it or anything stupid like that.
Yeah.
And so I guess the moral of that story from a safety point of view is you want to have as little change in your temperature as possible over the course of a dive. And so being in a high quality dry suit with good undergarments, and if you're wearing a suit heater, then probably the time to turn it on is during the decompression, not while you're swimming around on the bottom.
Yeah, sure. Well, it raised a question for me from a practical point of view, because as you say, you're wearing a dry suit. Typically at the beginning of the dive, you've come from a warm environment on board a boat or on land. You've gone into the water's cool, but your dry suit's doing its job. As the clock ticks, you're progressively starting, despite your thermal protection, you're progressively getting colder. So it would be almost normal for you to be coldest towards the end of the dive when you're decompressing. One practical thing, apart from wearing a heated suit and good quality undergarments, would be to do some light exercise while you're decompressing. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, that's a really good question too, Stephen. In fact, exercise was the next thing I was going to come to as a as a environmental, like, dive characteristic aspect of the dive. And let me get to that question of yours in a moment. So exercise is another classic risk factor where there's actually a substantial amount of evidence that it's important. So if you think about it, again, it's all to do with blood flow, right? Blood flow carries gas to the tissues, blood flow carries gas away from the tissues. So any changes in blood flow in either the on-gassing or off-gassing phase has potentially a profound effect on our risk. So if you dive and you're swimming around vigorously at the bottom when you're taking gas on, that's going to improve gas uptake. Well, it's going to increase gas uptake. We don't think of it as improving because we don't want gas uptake particularly.
Exactly.
So, exercise at the bottom, the harder the work you do, the more risky the dive, no question. Then during decompression, there's actually some evidence, to get to your question, that gentle exercise during decompression is an advantage. Now, there's probably two reasons for that. One is it might help keep you warm, which is what you were implying, but also the exercise itself will improve circulation. It will keep blood circulating. So rather than just hanging on a decompression line and getting cold because you're doing nothing, maybe holding onto it and gently finning, or swimming round and round in circles if your buoyancy control is good enough to stay in one place. Some people like to show off doing that. I'm not going to name any names, of course, but
here's the thing: if you're diving at that level, it should be that good, shouldn't it?
Of course it should. No, of course it should. Most people can do it. We all get a bit lazy. That's all.
In defense of the lazy people, I mean, when you're hanging at 6 meters for 2 hours, it's a pretty big deal. I think I watched Patrick Woodman and Skanda Caulfield, my guest in the last episode, and I think they might have been with Jake Ballman as well. They just did a massive dive in the caves in Mexico, and Patrick had a phone in one of those new Volt phone casings and they were watching movies. I mean, it can be a pretty boring time hanging at one level for hours on end. So yeah, I understand how it can get a bit boring, but hey, I'm just going to stay still for this time. And obviously it's not good for your decompression either. I mean, one thing I try and do is I practice back finning at that time. So I'll back fin away from the line, come back again. And it's a great time to sort of work on that skill. But as you say, provided you're doing something, if there's current, maybe you're hanging onto the line and just finning into it for a while. And
yeah, so there is some evidence. It's not as good as the evidence that working hard at the bottom is bad, but there is some evidence that working a little bit during decompression is good. And then just to finish that story, so exercise after you get back to the surface is probably bad. And the reason for that is that depending on the exercise you do, but it's possible that, especially if you're one of these people that's got a PFO, but it's not a particularly big one, exercise at the surface can actually open it up a little bit, and that might allow bubbles to get across into the arterial circulation. So exercises are actually quite a complex story. You know, it's good in some places and bad in others. And again, it speaks to the sort of intrigue associated with exercise, speaks to that point I made before about divers knowing physiology and understanding it being part of this whole game that we're in. It's not just jumping in the water and having good buoyancy skills. And there's quite a lot of knowledge that goes with the kind of advanced technical diving that we do, that I think divers really enjoy having that knowledge.
We do. I think your contribution to this whole field is simplifying it and making it digestible and understandable. You talked about taking the NEDU studies and making sense of them. I mean, quite often the studies are presented in very scientific ways, and the synopsis complex as well. So being able to take it and say, hey, look, here's what this data is telling us. This is what it means for our diving. And here's some examples of how you might adjust your dive practice to be working with the latest evidence. I think that's a major contribution to what we're doing, for sure.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Steve. I like to think that's true, but the way that that's evolved with me is that I was once on the other side of the equation, you know, a young guy struggling to understand all this stuff and utterly thirsty for the knowledge, but struggling to get it in a digestible form. So I've always understood that that's an issue, and I do try hard to present it in ways that are digestible for the community. And look, it's a two-way thing, mate. I get a lot of pleasure out of seeing the lights go on and people walking away from an interaction with more knowledge than they started it with. I really enjoy that myself. So it's a pleasure to do it.
Awesome.
Well, hey, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did making it. It was awesome to catch up with Simon again and talk about some of the contributions that he's made to decompression and hyperbaric medicine. It was awesome to talk about deep stops and I guess put that one to bed from our point of view. And also to talk about some of the other factors that influence our diving and our decompression. An amazing episode, and I so enjoyed bringing this one to you. So much more to cover, so look out for that next episode, part 2 with Professor Simon Mitchell. Thanks so much for joining me. Thanks again to XDEEP and the patrons of Speaking Sidemount. I'll look forward to catching up with you in the next episode.
You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.